Number 1. Camping. I once had a pretty terrifying experience when I was out camping. I'd gone out by myself, which was sort of my thing. I liked being out there by myself and away from people and society for a little while and just enjoying nature. For the most part of all the times that I went out camping, I never had any unusual experiences. I never came across Bigfoot or real animals that were scary. This was in my late 20s. I always took about 2 weeks in the summer in order to spend time out in the wilderness. About a week into my trip this time, I'd been out fishing when I noticed something unexpected. The pressure dropped pretty strongly outside, and the wind started blowing pretty hard. Very soon after, I noticed in the distance dark and menacing black storm clouds moving in. I hadn't expected a storm during the time that I was out, and I usually never had them when I was camping. This one looked like it was going to be a doozy as well. I stayed out for as long as I could before I knew I had to get back to my tent. I had some extra tent stakes that I brought along, and I decided that I needed to reinforce my tent. I figured extra stakes would help hold it down if the winds were really bad, and it seemed like the wind was going to get pretty fierce. I expected the storm to pass pretty quickly, since it had moved in quickly, but boy was I wrong. The storm continued strongly through the rest of the day and into the night. The fierce winds ripped at my tent, and I often felt like it would be pulled out of the ground at any time, but fortunately it didn't. With the sounds of the storm outside, it would have been difficult to hear anything else that was going on outside, but I also didn't expect to need to hear anything else. I was really surprised that, at one point, there was a very bright strike of lightning outside, which brightened up the entire night for just a really short moment. And during that very brief moment, I noticed the shadow of someone outside through the fabric of my tent. It was just for a second, but I know that I had seen it. It clearly looked like a person, as far as I could tell, but I had no idea why a person would have been out in this weather. The storm had been going on for hours already, and I couldn't imagine the stress one would have to be under in order to be out in the storm without having found shelter yet. On top of all those thoughts, I also began to feel a little scared. I didn't have the lantern on at the time, and didn't want to turn it on after seeing the shadow. If I was right and someone was out there, I didn't want to call attention to myself. Instead, I just kept quiet. Not that it really mattered being quiet when the storm was so loud outside, and I didn't move much. Hopefully, if there was someone out there, and I hadn't been seeing things, they would just move on and that would be that. I waited and kept watching as the storm raged on. I felt like a kid in a horror movie that was hiding in the closet, waiting for the killer to move on. Yeah, that was a bit extreme, as I had no idea what the person outside could have wanted, but I was too scared to try and have it make sense in my head. While I was sitting there, I heard a noise. It sounded like someone was fumbling with the tent's entrance, but fortunately, the tent couldn't be opened from the outside if it had been closed on the inside. Despite this, though, I reached into my bag and got out my gun. I had never actually had to use it before, but I always brought it in case something bad happened. After a moment, the noise stopped. I relaxed for a moment, but this didn't last long. I heard a puncturing sound and saw what looked like a knife tip coming through the front of the tent. I panicked, and there was no doubt someone was trying to get into my tent. I took the gun and fired it, although not directly at the entrance. I just wanted to scare whoever it was away. The knife quickly withdrew after the gunshot. However, there was too much going on outside with the storm to know if the person with the knife had gone or not. All I could do was sit in the middle of the tent, away from the sides, and wait to see what happened next. I couldn't hear nor see anything, and it was the most terrifying night of my life to that point. I didn't sleep at all, but when the storm finally left and the sun came up, I was able to tell that whoever was outside my tent was long gone. I had to get some sleep after that, and I fell asleep, but I woke up a lot since I was on edge and worried that he might come back. Number 2. Home Encounter. My family was pretty poor growing up. We had to move a whole lot, actually, as it was sometimes hard to pay rent, and our parents had to find new places to live. I can't really even remember how many times we had to find a new home, but one thing that was true was that, of all the houses we ended up renting, they were all rural homes, and that we never lived in town, not even once. Although she is in her late 80s, my mom is still alive, and she has never lived in town, even once in her entire life. When I was 12 years old, I remember one instance where my sister and I were home alone, in the house we lived in, out in a holler. My parents and other siblings had gone to visit my grandparents for the weekend. We didn't go because we both had too much schoolwork to do. Plus, we really wanted to stay home anyway. She was only a year older than me, but by that time, the two of us really wanted time away from our parents, whenever we could get it. Well, on Saturday night, a pretty violent storm came upon us. We both were slightly scared of thunderstorms at the time, but that didn't keep us from having fun. We, of course, decided to tell each other little scary stories in the dark, while the storm was ongoing outside. When you live out in the country like we did, it was easy to come up with scary stories because there were a lot of them, about people and things that lived in the hills and in the woods. I ended up telling one story that I had heard from the other boys at school, about some sort of dog boy or something that lived out in the hollers. I don't remember all the exact details of what was in the story, but I know that it had scared me, and it sure as hell scared my sister when I told her. It was that story that stuck with me the most because during the telling of that story, we lost the electricity in the house. I remember it well because there was a huge lightning bolt, followed quickly by deafening thunder. Then the entire house went completely dark. We went over to search for some candles in the different rooms of the house. At one point I heard my sister scream when she was in my parents' room. I was in the kitchen. We both ran toward the other and met up in the living room. She was absolutely terrified. My sister told me that while in my parents' room, she had caught someone watching her through the bedroom window. She had been looking at the window when another lightning bolt flashed in the sky, and for a brief moment, she saw some really freaky-looking guy watching her from outside the house. I told her that she was probably just seeing things. I mean, we had been telling each other scary stories all night, and it made sense that we would be a little freaked out. But she swore up and down that she had seen someone out there. I tried to convince her that even if someone had been outside the house, there was nothing to worry about. Dad's rifle always was right beside the door, and although we were forbidden to ever touch it, if someone tried to break into the house or hurt us, I'm sure he would overlook us using it. It was right then that there was a frantic knocking on the front door of the house. We both nearly jumped out of our skin. My sister screamed a little again and started repeating, "It's him," over and over again. Even though I was younger, I told her I would go and check the door. I went over and picked up the rifle. Cautiously, I went over to the door, unlocked it, slowly opened it, and looked outside. I didn't see anyone on the porch or in the yard. There was just no one there. I closed the door. No sooner had I locked it than I heard a knocking on the back door of the house. By this point, we were both freaking out. I didn't want to go and answer the back door too, and she didn't want me to either. Instead, we both went over to the living room sofa, taking the rifle with us. We spent the rest of the night on that sofa, waiting for something to happen, but the knocks on the back door of the house were the last knocks that we heard. The only other sounds we heard that night were of the storm raging on outside, so we really had no idea what went on that night. It was weird and eerie. We had both heard both knockings, and although I hadn't seen anyone, I never doubted that my sister did. We never knew who, or most importantly why, someone had come knocking on our door that night, in the middle of a storm. Number 3. Dog Walk. All I can think of concerning a scary story that happened to me when I was younger was more of a weird story than it was a scary story. This happened back when I was 13 years old. I wasn't very popular when I was in middle school, but it didn't really bother me. I lived out in a rural home, and was an only child who spent a lot of time by myself anyway. Being alone was normal for me, and I never really felt much of a need to have many friends. I was doing some volunteer work for an older lady who lived out in the general area that I lived in. Her husband had passed away not long ago, after they had been together for over 60 years. She wasn't able to do a lot of stuff on her own, at her age, so I went over to her house a few times a week to help her out. On this day, I had gone over early in the morning, and had done some chores for her that lasted until late afternoon. I could have called my parents for a ride when I got done helping out, but I didn't. It was a very long walk along the dirt road from her house to my house, but not something that I hadn't done many times before. Yet on this day, there had been a storm brewing for about an hour before I decided to head on home. It hadn't felt like rain yet, so I thought that although the walk was long, I would still be able to make it. Plus, there was something I liked about walking out in the country when the sky was black with dark clouds and rumbling with thunder. Maybe about a third of the way home, the wind began blowing a lot harder, and that made it difficult to walk since it was blowing right against me. I had felt a few drops of rain hitting me, but still held out hope that I wouldn't get caught in a downpour. My hopes didn't last for very long, though. Even as I hurried to try and futilely make it home before the rain, it began pouring before long. And even though it was a very warm summer day, for some reason the rain was very, very cold, and it had soaked me to the bone within only a few moments. At that point, I was so wet that I didn't care anymore, and didn't even avoid walking in mud puddles. It was then, when I was walking by a field, that the strange thing happened. Looking out in the field, I saw someone out in the field. He was a bit away from me, so I couldn't make out a whole lot of details, but he seemed to be dancing in the rain. It was such a weird thing to see, but I guess maybe he was just some sort of nature lover or something. But he honestly seemed like he was having a good time, dancing around in the field. I kept watching the guy as I walked along. After a bit of time, it looked like he noticed me, and after looking at me for a moment, he started walking in my direction. I tried to just keep walking and not pay much attention to him, but it was hard not to. He was a good distance away, but after walking for a few moments, he began running in my direction. Plus, he kept adjusting his run, so he was coming straight at me as I walked along. Now, here's the point in the story where people actually doubt my story. But I swear to you that this happened. When the guy got really close, he got down on all fours in the mud and the dirt, and started barking and growling at me as if he was a dog. And yet, despite this, he still came at me, baring his teeth like he wanted to bite me. I think this would have caught anyone off guard, but for me it was utterly terrifying to experience. I really had the impression that whoever this guy was, he was just freaking nuts, and I wanted to get away from him as quickly as possible. I began running away from him. A couple checks back showed that he stayed on all fours and even followed me for a while. Of course, there was no way he could keep up with me running this way, and he eventually seemed to give up. But that didn't stop me from running until I knew that I was far enough away from this nut to be safe to walk again. By the time I got home, I was wet and covered in mud, but I felt safe getting there. My parents thought it was just a guy fooling around, trying to play a prank on me or just scare me. If so, then that means he accomplished his goal. But I was convinced that the guy was just freaking crazy and was glad he didn't catch me. Number 4. Scarecrow. I grew up on a really small family farm. The farm was tended to by the whole family, plus we had one farmhand who lived and worked for us for a really long time. His name was Rod, and he had worked for my family from even before I was born. He was practically a member of the family, and most of the time, even had his meals with us. Rod had been with us for so long that I couldn't have imagined what life might have been like if he wasn't around. My bedroom was on the second floor of the farmhouse and was at the back of the house, so I was able to look out and see the cornfield behind the house at all times. It was actually pretty beautiful to look at it across all times, all during the years. One of the most common sights was to look out and see Rod out there working on a scarecrow or doing something else. The desk that I used to do homework was right in front of that window, so I spent a whole lot of time looking out it. Although we helped out on the farm, our parents were always strict about our schoolwork always coming first. But I enjoyed working on the farm, and on this day, I was out helping Rod with some of the farm work. It was a very windy day, and according to the weather report, we were going to get hit by some pretty fierce storms. So Rod and I had to get the farm ready for that. However, as the first drops of rain began to fall from the sky, he insisted that I get back to the house and get started on my homework instead. So I did this. I barely made it into the house before the storm arrived. It was pretty dark outside by that point, with the sky overcast in storm clouds. Even though it was only in the middle of the day, by the time I made it into my bedroom, it was so dark that I needed to turn on my desk lamp in order to actually do any work. Fortunately, even though I had a ton of homework to do, I really liked thunderstorms, so I was able to sit at my desk, work, and watch the storm rage on outside. At one point, some movement or something must have caught my eye. Something caused me to look up and out at the cornfield. When I did, I saw the scariest thing that I had ever seen in my life. One of the scarecrows appeared to jump down off of his perch and into the corn. I had to do a double take, but it didn't change the fact that I had seen what I had seen. I didn't know what to think of it, but I decided I needed to go and tell Rod what I saw. I found him in the kitchen having some coffee, and he thought that I must have been seeing things. But when he looked out the window, he saw that the scarecrow was gone too. Although it was storming pretty hard, he put on a coat and went out to check on the scarecrow. I think he did it more or less because he could tell that I had been really rattled by what I had seen. There definitely was no need to try and get the scarecrow back up during the storm. When he eventually came back, Rod looked just as rattled as I felt. He hadn't put the scarecrow back up because when he got out to it, he told me there was nothing there. There was no trace of the scarecrow at all. We both were pretty disturbed by this, and spent the rest of the day pretty freaked out. When we told my dad what happened, he felt that the scarecrow was just not secured well enough, and it must have fallen off in the storm, and was blown away in the storm. I don't know how likely this was, but it was the explanation he accepted. However, my dad hadn't been there, sitting at my desk, when I watched that Scarecrow jump off his perch. Maybe if he had been, he would have been just as scared as I was. Hey all, Killer Orange Cat here. First, I want to thank all my paid Patreon subscribers, starting with my 2 VIPs, Chiamerah Cat and Pixie Hopper 8. I also want to thank Stinky News, EricaOdd, Tracy Sellars, Chronic J, and Heidi H. I hope you guys like these stories, and I'm sorry for Patreon subscribers that I haven't had a exclusive video in there in a while. I'm working on right now, so that should be up soon. I'm going to try my best to keep up on that in the future. And I really hope you're having a nice summer and keeping cool wherever you are. And if you like the video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please hit the subscribe button and the bell so you'll be notified of new videos. Leave me a comment, which I'll try my best to get back to, and share the video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story, my email address is in the description. And now I'd like to thank all of my free Patreon members: Anthony Bowers, Remi, Venikins, Rose Metro, Woofer McWooferson, Cindy Cleveland, Vanapira Rayne, William H, Alien Unicorn 13, Kathryn Lynch, The Bama Guy 334, Michael Vasquez, Bonnie Lynn, Collet Bond, Krista Pike, Prince UVA, HF Creations, Bonnie Gibbs, Linda Moore, DJ Lira, and Evil Black Cat. But always, most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.